evening and welcome to this edition of DeFacto Review, a weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping Mongolia. Here with us tonight is Ms. Dulgong, a researcher and consultant at the Independent Research Institute of Mongolia. And we're live on Facebook at VTelevision, and we want to hear your thoughts, so send us your comments on Twitter with #jargat_DeFacto. Coming up on the program. Parliament meeting of dismissing potential government. How are political parties formed? The Independent Authority Against Corruption released a statement. So we're just going to jump into our first topic. So on November 7th, of this year, 27 members of Parliament submitted a proposal to the Speaker of Parliament, Mr. Inkbot, proposing to dismiss the government. So this issue was decided upon this past Friday at the Parliament session, and Prime Minister Hurulsuk's government is not overturned with a vote of 33 to 40. So of the 75 Parliament members, 73 were present. So what are some of the takeaways from this Friday's parliamentary session?
So first of all, thank you for having me here today. Indeed, the 30th of November, Friday, as some on social media has been claiming, was seen and labeled as Black Friday for Mongolia for its literal mean. Because whether the cabinet remained or whether it was dissolved, still the discussion and the parliamentary session highlighted one of the most difficult situations in Mongolia. So in that sense, I think the social media and public has been labeling it as Black Friday. So the main takeaway from the session is that, of course, just for the sake of being ironic, the attendance was very high, and there were a lot of complaints from people that when it's an issue about, for example, air pollution or important social topics, the attendance is never that high. So first of all, this kind of shows MPs' interest in the topic. And secondly, generally hearing all the MPs' discussion and comments, they all seem to agree that there needs to be some kind of political reform within how the transparency and accountability is implemented in Mongolia, especially within the political parties. So a few years ago, if this was an issue about just, few people raising these issues, but now it seems like there's a widespread consensus on the topic. However, it should be noted that there were still not concrete action plans presented to the cabinet on how it should proceed with fighting corruption and restoring justice.
And so with this Friday's decision, Hurulsuk's government is not overturned. So what kind of an impact will this have on the economy, do you think, in the short term and the long term?
So first of all, when the potential dissolution of the cabinet was being discussed and raised, there were few questions from researchers and public around this topic were raised. So first, for example, is the proposal to dissolve the cabinet really a response to lack of performance and as a measure of accountability, or was this predominantly a political action? So that was the first question. And secondly, even if the cabinet is dissolved or not dissolved, what are the next steps and plans for the parliament to continue reforming legislation or overall legal framework for reducing all the 7 issues that were included in the initial proposal? And third, even if the cabinet is dissolved, who will replace them? Is there an alternative and a capable pack of people who can run the government? So these were all remained questionable, although the parliament some candidates, some MPs who were for the dissolution of the cabinet, they did not provide concrete answers to these questions, which might have raised suspicions about their motive regarding the dissolution of the cabinet. But generally, as we all know, all of the public, including international organizations and community as well, have been watching Mongolia's political situation, and it's been very unstable in the last few decades. So this time there is, on the one hand, some kind of relief. At least the current policies will continue and it will not be slowing down. But on the other hand, how this, again, like I said earlier, how this issue about responsibility and accountability will be implemented are still unclear.
And so these parliament members, politicians in the parliament, are elected by the citizens. So, and they're supposed to be our voices for the actions we want in our country and so on. So how should citizens choose their representatives, or choose these members of parliament?
Luckily we live in a democratic society, so there are many forms of accountability within the democratic systems, one of which is political accountability, which is often shown during elections. So when people vote next time, I'm sure they will show their discontent or they will make their own choices. On the other hand, there recent studies and some public opinions show that people see non-government organizations, civil society and citizens as main drivers of anti-corruption fight. So people believe in those institutions, civil society, rather than the political institutions themselves. So it shows that people are still aware of these issues, they're still engaging in politics, and they're still interested in democratic system. So I think we should be very careful when we say maybe the elected representatives of the people are not doing their duties properly, therefore democracy is bad. If it's the opposite, we see now that our elected representatives are not doing their job properly. That's why we need to be very careful in the next elections to select potential candidates. But on the other hand, it's the duty of the political parties to propose good programs and be very transparent in selecting their candidates.
And so our second topic is slightly connected to our first one. So as you mentioned slightly before, Mongolia is a semi-presidential representative democratic republic with a multi-party system. And so within Mongolia, there are two major political parties currently. And so could you explain a bit more about these two political parties and what are their roles in government, how they influence the whole entire government?
The two main parties of Democratic Party and Mongolian People's Party, of course, as everybody knows. Any political parties and their competition constitute one important element of a democratic country, society. In that sense, it's important to have competent political parties. But when we ask whether these two parties have been successful, whether they have been delivering what they said and doing their functions, it's not difficult, but it's quite obvious from a citizen's point of view and also from studies. I just want to mention a few studies on people's opinion on the competency of political parties. For example, the Asia Foundation survey about corruption in Mongolia found that political parties ranked second out of 16 institutions as being the most corrupt, as seen by public, followed by mining, national government and parliament. The first place was Land Utilization Agency. So this shows how people see political parties as being a failure. And secondly, our recent survey, IREM's recent survey on social well-being, also showed that people were most dissatisfied with political and economic situation in Mongolia. Roughly around 70% of the people said that they are very completely dissatisfied. So these alone show the extent of the discontent people feel with political parties. And some may ask why people's feeling is important. They might not know the truth, or they might be delusioned, but we should take into consideration that one of the main reason political parties exist is to represent its electorate and deliver on what they promised. They should be responsible and responsive at the same time. So when we take these 4 criteria for quality political parties, we don't see any of the signs in these 2 political parties.
And so, what are there any rules and ethics that these Mongolian political parties must abide by, and how well are they abiding by these rules?
Of course, in many aspects, Mongolia is seen as having quite good papers, legislation and papers. Sorry, but it's interesting to see that the law on political parties has not been changed for a long time. So whereas other types of laws have been changing regularly, so we should ask why is it the fact that although political parties are being so incompetent and so far behind in terms of meeting people's expectations, why there is no reform or legal new legislation being passed? So that's one question we should ask. And secondly, within political parties themselves, of course, they have a set of rules and principles, vision, mission, and all those things. But it should be dependent on the internal governance of political parties. If political parties have good governance, they should have independent and very competent committee or some kind of body overseeing the implementation of those principles within the party. But we don't see none of the parties displaying strong such bodies, and they don't make statements, or they don't share with the public their plans how to improve the ethical and other standards, benchmarks within the political parties. So in general, there is a lack of good governance, not only the ethics, but all the other aspects as well.
And so a couple of researchers have cited that Mongolian these political parties are hindrances to Mongolians' development plans and so forth. So what should be done to kind of address this issue?
This is a very big question. First, of course, we should be aware that establishing a very well-functioning democratic country is a gradual process. That doesn't mean that we should stop trying and we should stop paying attention on all these scandals and misbehavior of politicians. So first of all, we need really strong and consistent voter education and civic education in Mongolia at all levels, just not only for students but also for adults. So the case of the US, for example, recently have demonstrated in states who have a strong civic education curriculum and states who don't have strong curricula had different levels of political education and engagement. So my first point would be to still focus on this kind of strong education of the public. And at the same time, we need renewal of the legislation around political parties. For example, before coming here, I was just looking at the Open Society Foundation's assessment of political financing. And they have, for example, proposed a lot of good measures the Mongolian parliament could take to improve political party environment, such as making sure that the sanctions around corruption are more effective and more dissuasive, and also the legal system, the 2005 law on political parties should be renewed, and the oversight of political financing, for example, by National Audit Office, should be stronger and clearer, etc. So there are many things that we can take. And third, should come from within the political parties themselves. If they have good governance, their members should take active role in providing oversight, providing internal discussion about those renewals. Yeah.
And so it seems to be that because these political parties are hindrance to Mongolia's development, let's say for hypothetical case that these two political parties were overthrown and instead a new political party was set in place, would corruption decrease in that case? And what are some steps to is it possible to even take down these two major political parties?
Of course, it's possible because like I said, we still live in a democratic society. In Mongolia, we have many political parties. So we still have theoretically and technically some room for alternative political parties. But of course, it's difficult for those third parties to come and to compete with these large two parties because of the issues of membership and the existing electoral law, which acts as a lot of hindrance to new members and new political parties. The financing is very difficult. So for these reasons, it would be a tough challenge for new parties to become majority. But in 2016, we saw a very interesting movement in Mongolia during the election, which was a blank ballot, the Tagan Songolt. It was a new form of political act, people showing that the political party should propose new and more transparent and competent candidates, way of selecting their candidates. And they basically need to innovate themselves and respond to their public. So I think what happened in 2016 and the recent events show active engagement from people's side. And as long as we have active engagement, critical thinking mass, and balanced media, independent researchers, and all these basic institutions of democratic society, there should be more increased competition.
And so, because we're a little bit pressed for time, let's move on to our third topic. So in response to Parliament member El Ayurtin's comment that law enforcement agencies were working to protect Mr. Inkbal yesterday by arresting family members of Parliament members, the Independent Authority Against Corruption released a statement. So just rewind back, and could you tell us how the IAAC was formed and under what directive? Why was it required to be formed?
Before giving the history about the anti-corruption agency in Mongolia, I wanted to say that worldwide there are around 100 anti-corruption agencies. Of course, with different names, with different powers and different capacities. But this has been one of the most new wave of countries showing their interest in fighting corruption. The basic reason behind why anti-corruption agencies exist is that they, first of all, show political will, that there is an interest to fight corruption. And secondly, they should be the official and national enforcer to implement and promote anti-corruption activities. So in that sense, there should be more support and also for anti-corruption agency, but also to make sure it becomes more effective. So we should be very careful in assessing an entire organization's legality or capacity just based on few cases or speculations. So moving back to the case of Mongolia, in 2006 the parliament has passed a law on against corruption, and in that law they specified the structure and the mandate of anti-corruption agency. The head of the agency is appointed by Parliament for 6 years term, and there are very clear requirements for eligibility criteria for the head. And also the corruption in agency has not only the function of inspecting and investigating corruption-related issues, but also it has the function of public awareness raising and public education and research. So we should also look at both sides of the agency.
And so since the establishment of this anti-corruption agency, has corruption levels decreased, or has it stayed the same, or has it increased? And if so, why?
To be able to answer this question, we need to be able to measure corruption exactly as it is. Unfortunately, we don't have such clear measurements and studies. Even worldwide, it's a topic of debate whether we can actually measure the level of corruption or not. There are proxies. Most widely used one is corruption perception surveys and index. Most famous one is used by corruption perception index by Transparency International, for example. But because those are perception based, sometimes the level of index can increase when people become more aware or more exposed to corruption issues and topics. So we should be careful in interpreting the increase and decrease in perception indexes. Just looking at crude numbers, in 2007, according to this index, Mongolia ranked at 99th out of 100. I forgot the exact number. In 2012, it ranked 94th, scoring 36, and in 2007, it ranked 99th. Also the same score, which means that the countries have made slight improvements in their situation.
And so do you think this anti-corruption agency is doing its job properly? If not, who or what is getting in their way of doing the job properly?
So I think the anti-corruption authority has been doing its best within its limited capacity, of course. And a lot of the international human rights and governance related organizations recommend, specifically for Mongolia and also for other countries, that it's in the agency's independence should be improved, should be made more, stable by law. Independence not only in terms of status, but also finance, protection and prevention from any political interference, protected by law, and independence in selecting its own staff, etc. So the main recommendation is to ensure that we provide them all this independence, and then prevent from any political interference and demand effective actions from anti-corruption agency.
And so should the anti-corruption agencies be serving the interests of the state or the government, or a mixture of the two?
The anti-corruption agency's mandate is to fight corruption within the society. So it should, its main mission should remain the same. In doing so, the agency should collaborate with every possible stakeholder, not only state and parliament or any agency within the state, but also civil society, citizens, international organizations, private sector. So I would say it should expand its engagement. In terms of serving the interest, it should still serve the societal interest of fighting corruption.
Well, thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us this week. Please join us next week at the same time for another weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping Mongolia. Good night.
Good night.